I just wanted to preempt this talk with some food for thought. So for a while now, the word bilingualism has been a collective term for the use of more than one language, and it has an underlying assumption that all subsequent language acquisition is the same. For example, the acquisition of a second language should not differ from a third language, and so on. However, more research is telling us that bilingual and multilingual processing may not be the same, with proof of cross-linguistic interference. Many theories and models have also been created based on bilingualism research. But the mounting question is, beyond the use of two languages, would the current set of theories still accommodate for multilingualism effects? I have divided my talk into three parts. The first one being an overview of the brain, focusing on the structural basics. The second part will be based on a book chapter that we have just written, where I will review the available evidence of bilingualism and multilingualism effects on brain structure. And in the last part of the talk is where I will share some new empirical findings involving monolinguals, bilinguals, and trilinguals. Now let's begin with an overview of the brain. On a micro level, our brains are made up of billions of nerve cells, or you can also call them neurons, and they transmit information throughout our nervous system. But for the purposes of this study, we're just focusing on the brain. And within the neuron, information is transmitted via electrical impulses from the dendrites down to the axon terminals. But between neurons, they actually communicate via chemical signals called synapses. And each of our neurons is estimated to be connected to 7,000 other neurons. On a more macro level, we often hear of the terms gray matter and white matter, but what do they actually refer to? So if we look at the diagram of a neuron on the left, it is partitioned into three parts. At the top, we have the cell body containing the nucleus, and surrounding it, we have the dendrites, which is where information from the previous neuron is being received. The information then travels down the axon, the portion in green, and it goes all the way, So at the axon level, surrounding it is a fatty tissue called myelin that allows the neuron to transmit information more efficiently. At the other end of the axon is the terminals where information actually leaves the neuron. And when all the neurons are packed together, the layer consisting of the dendrites and the axon terminals, they make up the gray matter, and all the axons consolidated together make up the white matter. So you might thus be able to tell that the gray matter is largely where information processing occurs, and the white matter is where information transmission occurs. The brain is also categorized into cortical and subcortical structures. Cortical structures refer to the outer layer of the brain involved in many higher level cognitive functions. It also underlies more controlled and effortful processes. Examples of cortical structures that might be familiar to some of you include Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Subcortical structures, on the other hand, are deep-seated within the brain. We'll be circling back to many of these subcortical structures later on. And for the longest time, people have believed that subcortical structures play only a supporting role to the cortical regions. But we now know that it's not true, and newer evidence suggests that they do play important roles of their own. Subcortical structures are also said to underlie more automated and less effortful activity. A wonderful feature of our brain is its ability to reorganize itself in order to develop, to learn, and to adapt to new experiences and demands. Experiences such as meditation, exercise, music training, video gaming, and even language learning have all been found to sculpt the structure and the function of our brains. But how does the brain actually do so? So it reorganizes itself in a number of ways. First of all, it could do it via the birth of new synapses or through the elimination of synapses. It can also do it through the growth of axons and dendritic spines, and it could also increase the myelination of axons. So you might have a question now. How does neuroplasticity relate to bilingualism and multilingualism? Well, the use of more than one language is a cognitively challenging skill to learn and to maintain. There is great complexity to it, involving various interacting components and systems. Furthermore, the neural representations of the languages that we speak are believed to be simultaneously and constantly active. And this creates a conflict in our abilities to understand and to produce language. It is a conflict that monolinguals do not experience, but one that bilinguals and multilinguals have to in order to communicate seamlessly. To facilitate this more effectively, the brain is said to adapt both structurally and functionally. So now that we have a better understanding of our brains, we can start looking at the evidence of restructuring from bilingualism and multilingualism. And for this segment, I will go through the evidence of 4 different populations ordered in terms of their language experiences. So I'll begin from the least experienced bilinguals and end off with multilingual experts. This segment will also include gray matter changes in both cortical and subcortical structures, as well as white matter changes. So first up, we have bilinguals with the least amount of language experience. An example of this population is bilinguals who are just acquiring a non-native language. When compared with monolinguals, this group of non-experienced bilinguals have been found to have larger cortical regions involved in language learning and executive functions. Also, the volume of cortical structures tend to increase with increasing second language proficiency. A large sample study by Haim and colleagues found that bilinguals who were scanned in the early stages of their second language acquisition actually had larger volumes in language areas as compared to monolinguals. And contrastingly, older long-term bilinguals showed no such difference when they were compared with monolinguals. In other words, the more experienced a bilingual is, the more similar they are to monolinguals. And interestingly, some longitudinal studies show that the expansions in cortical regions actually decline or disappear if bilinguals do not continue practicing their second language. So for this population of limited experienced bilinguals, there tends to be no subcortical effects. And in terms of white matter changes, the observations are more mixed. Some research have reported reduced diffusivity in white matter tracks, which can be interpreted as increased integrity or stronger connectivity, while other researchers have reported opposite findings. Now we're moving on to a more experienced population of bilinguals, such as simultaneous bilinguals and bilinguals who are immersed in an environment that uses their second language. Simultaneous bilinguals were found to be similar to monolinguals in the volume of cortical regions, while this is not the case for sequential bilinguals. Correlational analysis show that the later the age of second language learning, the greater the effects on cortical thickness. In other words, the later a second language is learned, the more the brain needs to do to modify itself. And unlike the previous population, bilinguals who are more experienced tend to exhibit subcortical effects. So from this point onwards, we start to see subcortical changes. For example, volumetric increases in the chordate nucleus, the putamen, thalamus, globus pallidus, and hippocampus have been identified. Furthermore, with increasing second language immersion, more subcortical effects in the form of both expansions and contractions have been observed. Matter effects become more consistent with this population of bilinguals, and it appears that when compared to monolinguals, experienced bilinguals have reduced diffusivity and higher myelin volume in tracts that are implicated in language functions. Such findings extend to both experienced child bilinguals and older lifelong bilinguals. And to elaborate further on the impact of immersive language experiences, sequential bilingual children actually only exhibited reduced diffusivity to the same extent as simultaneous child bilinguals after 3 years of continuous use. So we have just reviewed the evidence for limited and experienced bilinguals. But what actually happens with a third language and more? The acquisition and mastery of more than one language would mean having multiple language systems to process, to monitor, and to control. And this involves various grammatical, phonological, semantic, and even orthographic systems. The control demands of multilingualism are thus argued to diverge from those of bilingualism. Furthermore, there have been evidence of multilingual cross-linguistic interference and influence on brain structure and function. Now let's take a look at what happens if one knows a third language. When compared with bilinguals, trilinguals in a study by Grogan and colleagues found greater density in the posterior supramarginal gyrus, and this cortical region of the brain is associated with lexicon size. Previous research comparing bilinguals and monolinguals similarly found this region to be denser in bilinguals than in monolinguals. This highlights the additive effect of language acquisition in areas that are typically affected by subsequent language learning. In another study on multilinguals, it was found that consecutive multilinguals had larger volumes in several regions related to language processing as compared to simultaneous multilinguals. Very similar to what was found in the bilingualism literature, early or simultaneous exposure to two languages seemed to make the structural adaptations less responsive to the learning of a third subsequent language. And this might be because the neural networks become more efficient and capable of accommodating for two languages at once. The same process of expansion seems to occur each time you add a new language. Just like experienced bilinguals, trilinguals exhibited subcortical effects. For instance, the putamen, a subcortical structure implicated in articulatory processes, was found to have greater density in trilinguals than in monolinguals. Furthermore, in multilinguals, the earlier the age of acquisition and higher the proficiency, the greater the volume of the chordate, which is a subcortical structure that's key in cognitive control and language switching. In terms of white matter effects, likewise, reduced diffusivity and increased axonal packing density was found in early multilinguals as compared to late multilinguals in tracks that are connecting language regions. For example, the arcuate fasciculus, which connects Wernicke's area with Broca's area, has reduced diffusivity in early multilinguals. So the consistent narrative that we have here is that the consecutive learning of languages have greater structural implications on the brain. Now, who would have greater language experience than trilinguals? This is where we are brought to the fourth population, said to be the most experienced wielders of language, simultaneous interpreters and translators. This group of multilingual experts have remarkable abilities to switch between languages more frequently and at higher intensities than the average multilingual. The key difference between simultaneous interpreters and translators is that simultaneous interpreters undertake a cognitively challenging task of switching between languages in real time, and hence they do have more opportunities to practice and hone language control. For this population, a very striking pattern of restructuring begins to occur. So this is where things get a bit more interesting. Rather than grey matter expansions, as we have noticed in the previous populations, when compared with translators, simultaneous interpreters have smaller volumes in cortical and subcortical areas that are known to be involved in language control and processing. In fact, the more time spent performing simultaneous interpretation, the smaller the volumes of these regions, and that includes the chordate nucleus. In terms of white matter effects, reduced diffusivity was found after a 9-month simultaneous interpretation training in networks that involve subcortical areas, and this suggests increased connectivity and engagement with subcortical regions. So from what we have seen so far, it seems that as language experience increases, cortical adaptations are followed by white matter and subcortical effects. The adaptations seem to move posteriorly. And secondly, structural expansions seem to be replaced with contractions. And this could be interpreted as signs of renormalization. And renormalization could be driven by pruning, where underutilized connections that were initially formed to develop the skill are being removed and retaining only the most efficient ones. So what could explain for these patterns of structural changes? Well, they all revolve around the brain's ability to adapt and to reorganize. And first of all, the expansion, exploration, selection, and refinement theory, ESR for short, suggests that when a motor skill is being learned, there is a mismatch between supply and demand, or you can think of it as goal behavior and existing capabilities. Hence, brain regions that are relevant for the task need to expand, and the available circuits are being explored before a selection is made of the best performing circuit. And the process concludes by retracting the new, unselected, and less effective circuits. This theory sufficiently explains for the trajectory of grey matter changes in motor skill learning, but which grey matter areas are expected to adapt through multilingualism. For this, we have three neurolinguistic theories. First of all, the adaptive control hypothesis, which predicts that the brain adapts to specific demands from different conversational contexts. And language switching involves a network consisting of both cortical and subcortical areas that are important for executive control. And these areas include the left inferior frontal gyrus, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the thalamus. Compatible with the ACH is the BEPS, which is short for the bilingual anterior to posterior subcortical shift model, which posits that with increased second language use, the brain actually engages less of frontal regions which underlie more effortful and controlled processes, and instead relies on more subcortical and posterior networks, indicating a more automated approach to control. Aligned with the BEPS is a three-stage model by Pliatsikas that predicts patterns of brain restructuring based on language experience. In the first stage, the initial exposure to a new language leads to expansions in cortical structures and in some cases the caudate nucleus. This is in response to the demands of a rapidly growing vocabulary, as when you do learn a new language, and the demands of controlling between lexical alternatives. With further language experience, a bilingual may arrive at the consolidation stage. This is where demands revolve around controlling between the available semantic, phonological, and grammatical alternatives. And at this stage, cortical structures are expected to go back to a baseline volume, while subcortical effects begin to emerge in the form of mostly expansions. Finally, highly experienced bilinguals or multilinguals may arrive at the peak efficiency stage, and this stage is characterized by the stabilization or the reduction of subcortical volumes and further decreases in frontal connectivity. So what could be next? Most of the research documenting structural adaptations compared between monolinguals and bilinguals, and a pool of studies on multilingualism effects remain really small, making it insufficient for us to arrive at a sharp conclusion on what happens beyond two languages. From the evidence we've seen so far, we see that subcortical adaptations only become more apparent with increased experience. Therefore, if we want to understand the effects of greater language experience, for instance, in multilingualism, subcortical structures should be paid more attention. So now this brings me to the third and final segment of my talk, which is where I'll share with you some fresh empirical findings from a study on monolinguals, bilinguals, and trilinguals. We formulated some research questions, the first one being which subcortical structures would adapt with increasing language experience, and the second one being what is the trajectory of subcortical restructuring as language experience increases. Anchored in the theories and the evidence mentioned earlier, we hypothesized that with increasing language experience, subcortical structures that are key in language switching and articulatory processes would be the fastest to exhibit renormalization, which is an expansion followed by a contraction. These structures include the chordate, thalamus, putamen, and accumbens, and the ones that might be slower to renormalize include the hippocampus and the amygdala. A full renormalization is expected to look something like this. So there's a little figure in the bottom right corner. We expect to see a significant increase from monolinguals to bilinguals, followed by a significant decrease when we arrive at the trilinguals. In English monolinguals from the UK, 14 bilinguals and 14 trilinguals from Malaysia underwent an MRI scan. These are the scanning protocols that we used. And over here I have some subject demographics. So the monolinguals are born and raised in the UK with minimal exposure to a second language. Both bilinguals and trilinguals have acquired their languages relatively early. On average, the bilinguals acquired both languages before the age of 6. And for trilinguals, they acquired all 3 languages before the age of 7. And an important point to note is that Malaysia is a very multilingual country. So for most of these subjects, they are immersed in an environment that exposes them to their different languages. The MRI data was first pre-processed. For this, brain extraction was performed on the T1 weighted images using FSL, and the brain image was then segmented into the 7 subcortical structures. Next, the total brain volume and volumes of the subcortical structures were extracted using FSL stats. And in order to account for individual variability in brain size, normalized volumes were obtained by calculating the volume of each subcortical structure as a proportion of total brain volume. The normalized volumes were then compared across the 3 groups using an ANCOVA with sex and age added as covariates. This is a visual overview of the results, and this is just for illustrative purposes only. And it shows us the volumetric means of the 7 structures. On the y-axis is the normalized volumes, and over here the use of violin plots shows us the distribution of the means, where the broadest points represent the means with the highest frequency within the group. The orange violin plots represent the monolinguals, blue for bilinguals, and yellow for trilinguals. We will look at the results for each structure one at a time. This is another overview showing that the chordate nucleus might be the fastest at renormalizing, followed by the accumbens, and then the rest of the subcortical structures. Across the board, except for the chordate, subcortical structures expanded significantly in bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, which is expected of more immersed or experienced bilinguals according to the Dynamic Restructuring Model. Now let's begin with the accumbens. We observed a significant expansion of the accumbens in bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, but not with the trilinguals, which we interpret as a renormalization. So as you can tell, it's much larger in bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, and then it falls again when we reach the trilinguals. If we recall from the bilingualism literature, the accumbens contract with increasing language experience, and it lies in a strategic location within circuits related to a range of roles such as action selection, motivational behaviors, inhibitory control, and reinforcement learning. And these are processes that are integral to bilingual and multilingual language processing and control. Hence, the accumbens may have achieved optimization for these processes, propelling it towards renormalization, allowing us to do the most with the least. A renormalization may also be attributed to a decreased reliance on reinforcement learning, since most of the bilinguals and trilinguals are in an immersive environment. Now, moving on to the chordate mucus, the chordate actually gave us a very interesting null effect or non-finding, where monolinguals, bilinguals, and trilinguals have very similar chordate volumes, and this is especially so for the right chordate. And there are two ways of looking at this. The first way is that no restructuring occurred at all, or a second way, it actually restructured at the fastest rate. It is less likely that no restructuring occurred at all, as from our recollection, chordate effects tend to be found in non-experienced bilinguals versus monolinguals, but not in immersed bilinguals. Additionally, we saw from previous research that chordate volume decreases with increasing number of hours spent simultaneous interpreting. Evidence make it more likely to believe that it may have renormalized most drastically at the fastest rate. Chordate effects have also been predicted by the adaptive control hypothesis and the dynamic restructuring model. More specifically, it is expected in the dual language context and at the peak efficiency stage. Anatomically, the chordate receives most of its input from the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of general executive functions. And the chordate underlies multiple functions that are key to bilingual and multilingual processing. These roles may hence heavily implicate the chordate, speeding up its process of optimization. The right chordate may have renormalized faster due to its additional role in speech production. From here on, the following structures, we have 5 left, exhibited the same pattern of restructuring, where the volumes are significantly bigger in both bilinguals and trilinguals when compared to monolinguals. And there are no interaction effects between hemisphere and group. So bilinguals and trilinguals are the same as compared to monolinguals. Now we have the pallidum and the putamen. So these two structures make up the basal ganglia together with the chordate. And the basal ganglia is predicted to be involved in bilingual processing and control. The putamen in particular is proposed to the adaptive control hypothesis once again. And in line with the dynamic restructuring model, these structures are expected to have stable volumes at the peak efficiency stage, which the bilinguals and trilinguals in our sample might actually be at. The putamen and globus pallidus have overlapping roles in both general and language-specific processes. For instance, they are involved in movement regulation, in bilingual speech production, and articulatory control. And as compared to monolinguals, both bilinguals and trilinguals are exposed to a wider range of speech sounds and have greater articulatory needs. But the question is, why might bilinguals not differ from trilinguals? The similar volume between them may be attributed to consistent articulatory control demands. For example, the putamen was previously suggested to be involved in moment-to-moment suppression of the non-target language. Hence, knowing 2 languages, 3 or 4 or 5 languages should not increase the articulatory control demands, since at any point in time we can only articulate in one language. An alternative explanation could be that the articulatory demands actually do increase for trilinguals because they do have a wider range of speech sounds in their repertoire. But the capabilities have yet to catch up with the demands, such that the brain is still in a state of exploration in order to identify the most efficient circuit. Likewise, a similar pattern of restructuring occurred for the hippocampus and the amygdala. These are structures that are important for learning, for memory, spatial, and metaphorical language processing. and these are dynamic and ongoing needs that require constant update. It is possible that bilinguals and trilinguals with their increased linguistic repertoire would have greater lexicosemantic processing load. After all, they have to associate semantics with lexical candidates from 2 to 3 different languages. This could also be a process which needs to be maintained and updated over time, forming a persisting demand for both groups. Furthermore, we see in previous studies that axons grow within the hippocampus in response to learning, and elderly long-term bilinguals have larger hippocampal volumes than monolinguals. And this shows us that despite immersion and experience, this structure remains enlarged as compared to monolinguals. Hence, perhaps, to continually meet the demands in these aspects, neural resources must be maintained. Most relevant to this context, the amygdala is involved in spatial processing, a skill required by the trilinguals in this sample, where they all use a non-alphabetic script. So they do have more experience with elaborate analysis of spatial information. Finally, we have the last subcortical structure, and that's the thalamus, and it's a surprising finding. Thalamic effects were predicted in the ACH, and it's a structure implicated in language functions and in past bilingualism research. In particular, it plays roles in selecting relevant lexical and semantic representations. And because of these, we were expecting a renormalization. However, this was not observed. So why might that be? The thalamus is, after all, a very large structure and a relay hub with extensive projections and functions linked to various regions of the brain. It has a myriad of roles, not limited to language systems and motor control. For example, it is involved in memory, it's involved in sleep and consciousness, it's implicated in every sensory system. Perhaps a further increase in language experience, as represented by the trilinguals, may not be enough to trigger the restructuring of the entire structure. Or perhaps we simply lack the sensitivity to detect any reshaping. So to round up, these are the key points from the empirical findings. The use of 2 languages is associated with increased subcortical volumes. And subcortical adaptations are dynamic, they are not fixed across all structures, and they do not all proceed at the same rate. The trajectory seems to consist of an expansion followed by a contraction, which may be interpreted as renormalization and optimization. The fastest structures to adapt appear to be structures with central roles in domain general cognitive functions that are similarly vital in handling multiple languages. The ESR theory may apply not just to with regards to theoretical implications, the ESR theory may not apply to just general motor skill learning, but also to advancing language skills. The results are in support of the neurolinguistic models, including the ACH, the DRM, and the BEPS, predicting the engagement of, if not a shift, towards more posterior and subcortical recruitment, where processes have become more effortful and more efficient. All in all, these findings highlight the remarkable ability of our brain to continually reorganize, to achieve and to maintain efficiency, allowing us to do more with less. This is all I have, and thank you for your time.